So if you're our guest, let me explain that you find us toward the front end of an annual summer message series based on questions or topics suggested by our congregants. And today marks a first. In the past, you guys have asked me about parts of the Bible, passages, or in one case, an entire book in the Bible, that you had a hard time understanding. So you wanted me to spend a Sunday and try to help you understand those things better. Well, someone this year emailed me when I solicited from you questions and topics, just this very personal request. Would you mind preaching about my favorite verse in the whole Bible? Luke chapter 23, verse 34. And I thought, sure, why not? So to do that, I need to take us back to one of the great holy days of the Christian faith, as recorded in the Gospel of Luke, what we now call Good Friday. And the person's favorite verse will appear in red as I read through some of the verses that surround it in Luke. You know what? I forgot to put it in here, so I'm going to read it off the screen. 2 criminals were also led away to be put to death with Jesus. When they came to this place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. All the people stood by watching. The religious leaders scoffed at Jesus, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, God's chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine while saying, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." This is the first of 7 last words of Jesus from the cross. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." In this single verse, you and I will see the exhilarating, daunting heights of Christian forgiveness as embodied by the person of Jesus. The longer we linger with this verse, the more you will be able to see into its depths. And that's really what I hope happens for you today. That the longer we think and talk about this verse, the more you appreciate it, the more you see how deep down it goes. So to do that, let's begin by talking about the third person plural pronouns in this verse. They and them. To whom is Jesus referring when he cries out in agony from the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing"? Is it perhaps the Roman soldiers who put him on that cross, for whom this was a weekly occurrence, for whom violence against lessers was normalized? They thought nothing of what they'd done to Jesus. Who is them? Who is they? Is it perhaps the crowds who stood by and watched? Some of the people who stood by and watched thought, Jesus is getting exactly what he deserves. We thought he would be the Messiah to come and deliver us from the oppression of the Roman Empire, and he chose not to be that person. We are so deeply disappointed. This is precisely where we thought this would all end up. Perhaps others in the crowds in the crowd that day were thinking, this kind of thing happens all the time to neighbors that we know, to our fellow countrymen, and there is nothing we can do about it. So we stand by and watch the horror of injustice over and over again. Who's the they? Who's the them? Is it Pilate, who made a politically expedient decision to keep the peace by getting rid of a troublemaker? Who's the they? Who's the them? Is it the Jewish religious leaders for whom the cross was the fruition of a calculated plan? This was first-degree murder, not second, for the Jewish religious leaders. Who's the they? Who's the them? Is it perhaps the Jewish religious leaders who felt like Jesus, the revolutionary, threatened their power, and so they rendered him powerless? Is it perhaps the disciples, almost none of whom were present to watch this happen? Who's the they? Who's the them? So perhaps as you hear me walk through that, you might conclude with Edward McLeod of First Presbyterian in Raleigh, North Carolina, quote, "They and them in Luke 23:34 are the good news of the church, declaring God's grace wide enough to include everyone. Those of us condemned by our own decisions, those of us drenched in compromise, those of us complicit or unaware, and those of us broken in ways that we cannot mend on our own." End quote. I do not know what it is in your life you feel like no one can forgive. But you are included in they and them, as am I. Second, Jesus walked his talk so that others would walk his talk too. Here are things that Jesus has taught over the course of the Gospel of Luke. This is from Luke chapter 6. "But I say to you who are listening, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for he himself is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven." 11 chapters later, Jesus says, "And if the same person sins against you 7 times a day and turns back to you 7 times and says, 'I repent,' you must forgive." Whatever else the crucifixion of Jesus was, it was the crucible moment for him, when you and I and the whole watching world got to see if he was as committed to his message as he was telling us to be committed to his message. And it doesn't stop there. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." Did anybody, Roman soldiers, the watching crowds, Pilate, the religious leaders, the disciples, did any of them ask him for forgiveness? The answer is no. Again, Edward McLeod of First Presbyterian, Raleigh, North Carolina. "This text challenges our typical calculus of forgiveness, as we assume that forgiveness comes to those who confess. Luke gives no record of Pilate, the religious leaders, the soldiers, or the crowd seeking forgiveness for what they'd done. On the contrary, Jesus petitions for divine forgiveness and not divine retribution for a people who are still hopelessly entangled in a great conspiracy of evil." Paul the Apostle saw this as the gist of the good news in Romans chapter 5, verse 8. "While we were still sinners, Christ died for us." End quote. Let's be clear about what Jesus is asking. In ancient Greek, that word forgive means to release someone or remit someone from the consequences of their actions. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Don't let the consequences of this action fall upon them. Whatever else this verse does, it should prove in stark relief to all of us forever that God is more willing to forgive us than we are willing to ask for it. That God is more willing to forgive us than we are to acknowledge our own offenses. Do you think God listened? Do you think God heard his son say, "Don't hold this against them"? And he didn't. So one of the things you need to know about the New Testament is that the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles were written by the same person, very likely at the same time or near to it, and they are meant to be read as companion books. The Gospel of Luke is, of course, the story of Jesus. The Acts of the Apostles are how the church begins to live into what Jesus did and taught and accomplished in the Gospel of Luke. So it does not surprise us that when the first Christian, at least by name, is murdered for his faith, Stephen, at the end of Acts chapter 7, when he is being stoned to death, the last words out of his mouth are, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." Yeah, Jesus walked his talk so that then Stephen would walk his talk too. And this is what Christians over the course of church history have been hoping to do ever since. In 1957 in Montgomery, Alabama, this is what Martin Luther King Jr. taught in a sermon entitled, "Love Your Enemies." Jesus says, love them, and love is greater than like. Love is understanding, redemptive goodwill for all people, so that you love everybody because God loves them. And here you come to the point that you love the individual who does the evil deed while hating the evil that person does. This is what Jesus means when he says, love your enemy. Forgiveness is not an occasional act. It is a permanent attitude. We must develop and maintain this capacity to forgive. He who is devoid of the power to forgive is actually devoid of the power to love. End quote. What's your calling as a Christian person in the world? Sure, it is to tell people about Jesus, to proclaim his wonder and his truth. But it is also to embody Jesus to the watching, needy world. And one of the chief ways you and I do that is to endeavor to forgive as Jesus forgave, which at the very least begins by loving the people who hurt us so, even if we have been deeply marked by what they've done to us. And perhaps all we can do is what Stephen did in his last dying breath. God, these people who are killing me are your children. Don't hold this against them. Part of why Jesus, and likely Stephen, was able to have this point of view on those who assailed them is because they understood evil in a way that perhaps you and I don't, a more expansive way. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Jesus did not just see evil as evil. He also saw it as ignorance. In the Acts of the Apostles, less than 2 months later, The Apostle Peter will explain the events of the crucifixion by saying, you who were there or who heard of this did what you did, not knowing what you did. Paul in the New Testament, who writes most of the letters that make up your New Testament, will talk about sin using metaphors like sin is darkness. Sin is bumbling around in a dark room when you cannot see the way. Sin is insensitivity. It's me not being able to feel my way through life. Sin is hardness. Sin is ignorance. Paul uses all four of those metaphors in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 17 to 19, about what it means to be broken, what it means to be sinful in this world. This aligns with what the Old Testament says. In Proverbs, what's the opposite of wisdom? It is not sin. It's foolishness. It's ignorance. And that ignorance and foolishness, sometimes willed, results in massive amounts of harm to self and to others. Do you know who gets this, by the way, in the story of the Gospel of Luke? In fact, he's going to get it just a few verses after this one. The Roman centurion. Probably the person in charge of Jesus' crucifixion was a Roman officer known as a Roman centurion. And after all is said and done, and after Jesus dies, we are told in verse 47 of Luke 23 that the centurion, after he saw all of this take place, praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." No other Roman soldier that day who crucified Jesus cared a whit about whether or not Jesus was guilty or innocent. He was just their duty for the day. The people gathered around that day likely were torn between whether or not Jesus was guilty or innocent. Guilty of being too heavenly minded to be of any earthly good. Innocent and suffering for it. Have you had experiences in your own life, perhaps about yourself or about others, where you see, what looks like evil, if I dig down a little deeper, is a lack of wisdom. It's a lack of knowing. It's ignorance. It's short-sightedness, morally, psychologically, spiritually. We had friends that in my church in Michigan that our kids would go over and see periodically because they had kids of the same age. Until one day our kids came home and they said, "Boy, in this home, there's a lot of yelling. And there's a lot of yelling about all kinds of things, all kinds of the time. One small thing happens, somebody forgets to do a chore, and all of a sudden tempers flare." Why do you suppose that happens? Is it evil? Is it just their personality? Or is it ignorance? Well, I know those parents' story, and I know that they were both raised in homes where they were treated the same way. And all they were doing was passing on, almost completely unaware to themselves, to their children, how they were treated as children. The examples are long. What if you and I tried not just to see at least some of the evil in the world, the evil around us, the evil that happens to us, as ignorance, not just wickedness? It's such a softer word than the hard word, sinful. I had a light bulb moment as a pastor about this when in my church in Michigan for about 2.5, 3 years, I was subjected to the worst kind of congregational mistreatment. And it has left a mark on me that will never leave. But upon reflection and learning and growth, I can look back on that and say and see those folk were under tremendous stress. They were really anxious about their church and its future, and they had made a mess they didn't feel like they could solve. And when you put people under that kind of duress, what they tend to do is get angry and act out. Those were not evil people. They were ignorant people who lacked the wisdom and maturity to handle that they were subjected to. And by the way, I think I lacked the maturity and the wisdom to help them handle it too. Let me end with this. And I was actually able to confirm this morning with our favorite attender of the University of Richmond that this person I'm about to cite for you is still the chaplain at the University of Richmond. His name is Craig Kocher. In writing about this passage, he reflects as follows. In a Good Friday world, we need a God who is not distant or obtuse to our suffering. As much as the crucifixion holds up a mirror to humanity's bent towards sin and death, it also reveals God's unending love for our broken world filled with evil and violence. Like Christ on the cross, love bears all things, love hopes all things, and love endures all things. Indeed, God's very own heart was torn in two, not only by the brutal suffering of our world that his Son experienced firsthand, but also by his passion and determined grace to forgive those who did not know. End quote. So I told the person who submitted this topic for today that I would keep him anonymous, but he emailed me this week about why this verse is his favorite verse. And I want to end with two sentences from what he sent, because perhaps at the end of me talking for 20 minutes about it, you are a little closer to being where he is about this magisterial verse in Luke 23. He sent me this week, quote, "Somewhere in this verse and other scriptures like it are the answers to those questions we may all have about forgiveness. This is my favorite passage, not because of what I know about it, but because of what I have left to learn about it."